Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about photo editing. Now, I should tell you that I teach a whole class on photo editing, so today is just a little sampler of the things that we work through in that class, but I think it's important to have a rough idea of what is photo editing, what are the things that I'm looking for, what does the process generally look like, so that we can unpack that more later on. So we're going to look at a couple of different things that I've kind of gleaned over the years to kind of make sense of the photo editing process. And the first thing we're going to talk about really is the photo editing cycle. The cycle you go through as you're working on a long form project, how you go about accruing the best of the best images, what is the process like that goes on. And so this cycle is simply, we start out with the shooting phase, so we're making pictures. We move on to the editing phase, so we trim down our pictures, we edit down what we have. We move on to the toning phase, where we're actually color correcting our images and getting them to sit right next to each other. And then we move on to sequencing those images, putting them in order, and then we return back to the shooting phase. So you have this cycle that always is going on, always, always, always. We start at the beginning and we move our way through over and over and over until we've accrued the right amount of images to produce the work that we're working on. Now, in saying that, they say that there's no finished projects, there's just projects that you give up on. So either you finish a project because you're on a deadline and you don't have any more time, or you just are tired and can't do it any longer, and that becomes the project. I think a lot of projects never feel fully done, but this is kind of the process of how we get as close to that as we possibly can. So let's talk about the first phase, which is the most obvious one, and that's making photographs. Now, I should tell you that there actually is something before this, and that's kind of the planning phase. I would say the more prepared you are to approach a subject, the better. So I always like to do a lot of research. I like to read up on whatever it is that I'm photographing. If I have a very specific subject matter or a specific person or group of people or area or whatever, I do like to be really well informed. But in saying that, I don't want all of the research that I've done to totally dictate where the project is going and what's going to happen in that project. I have found that it's great you have to do a lot of research, be prepared to approach your subject thoughtfully, that you can hold conversations well with whoever you're interacting with, but that's not going to get you to the good pictures necessarily. You still have to come into a space with a person with open hands. You have to be open to what you're going to receive in that place, in that experience. It's still a discovery project. So do good research, but don't let that kill the discovery that you're going to possibly have in that process. So you have to have a balance there for sure. Now, apart from that planning, the planning portion of it, which should be an understood, we start off by making pictures, okay? And you have to be careful with the planning phase, because sometimes that will keep people from even starting a project. They'll think about it and think about it and think about it, and they won't start. And a lot of times people will think about it and they're like, well, I don't know how it's going to finish. I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know. And the only way to figure that out is to make work. Like, you have to work through it by making the pictures. So the first stage, you got to make pictures. You got to make a lot of pictures. In that process of making pictures, you have to, again, walk into that situation with your hands open. I'm a firm believer you walk into the world with your hands open to receive the things that are around you. A photographer is a viewer of the things around them. And so you have to come into it openly. You have to discover and explore that world that you're entering into, even if that's your own personal world, even if that's your own home with your own family, whatever that might be. You still have to come into it with fresh eyes and open to discovering the things that are going to be handed to you, which is very, very important. Now, I would assume everybody would agree with this, but I'm always surprised at how many people don't put in a lot of work making pictures and they think that their project is going to be good. So if you do not invest an extreme amount of time into the shooting phase, then everything else we're going to talk about today is worthless. You can't color correct your way to a good project. You can't Photoshop your way into a good project. You can't, write a long enough artist statement to make your pictures good. A lot of people try to do that, but it just doesn't work. The only way to make good pictures is to make good pictures. And the only way to get to the good pictures is you got to make a lot of bad pictures first. It's just part of the process. The percentages in photography are not good. If you were an athlete, they would be an absolute failure. But for photographers, you have to make a lot of bad work before you can uncover the good work. It's just part of the process, okay? So once we begin making a lot of pictures, and I would say, depending on how long your project, like how much time you're going to devote to your project, I would maybe shoot a couple of days at least. I wouldn't like shoot for an hour and then go to the editing phase necessarily, but I might shoot for a couple of days, kind of work my way around it, and then dump all my pictures onto my computer or send your film off or whatever your process is and start making your selections, which is the editing phase. So I'm going to use two different nomenclatures kind of for editing and for toning. A lot of people say, they use the word editing and that they mean color correction. When I say editing, I mean selecting the right pictures, saying this picture is not good, this picture is good. When I'm talking about color correction, I say toning. Okay, so those are going to be the two different terms that I use. Editing is making selections. Toning is the color correction portion of the image process. Okay, so when you are editing, when you are making these selections, all you're doing is seeing which pictures are working and which pictures aren't. And that is really challenging for a lot of people because you're very close to your own work. You were there when you made the pictures. You're bringing so many other things to that experience because you remember what you heard. You remember the smells. You remember, the things outside of the picture, outside of the box. And that can be really dangerous because as a viewer, I don't know any of that stuff. I don't know how great of a meal you had when you were there making those pictures. I don't know the great conversations you had. I don't even know the profound things that person was saying while you were photographing them. None of that stuff matters if it's not in the frame. If it's not in the box, it doesn't qualify the image as being good. So you have to be able to take a step back and judge the image based upon its merit. Now, how do we do that? So I've created this kind of really basic hierarchy of if a picture is good enough to pass go, and this is a basic structure. This in no way is gospel. There are different thoughts on some of this stuff, but I think for newer photographers, this is a good place to start, and it gives you a really basic value judgment structure for the images that you're looking at. Now, to do this, definitely you have to try to remove yourself from those pictures as best you can, because again, you're bringing a lot of presupposition, a lot of memory, a lot of intention to that conversation, and it doesn't matter what your intention is if the work is not good enough or it doesn't do that. All that matters is what is in the box, what is in the frame. Anything that you bring outside of that, now definitely every narrative is going to have some kind of historical context and cultural context and all those things. But if we're just judging how good an image is based upon the image, then we have to just look at what's in the box. It's very, very important. And I would say before we go through this, if you're fortunate enough to be able to like shoot a little bit and actually put the work away for, a couple of weeks or a month, sometimes that helps you distance yourself from that work enough to come back and look at it with new eyes. But I very seldom ever have that experience. Most of the time I'm editing, a couple of days or the day of after I've shot some. So this is a practice where you have to distance yourself. And so to do that, I've created kind of this just very basic structure to judge if an image is good enough to keep or not. So there's this hierarchy that I've created, this little pyramid. The bottommost kind of foundational thing of judging is an image good enough to keep is just basic technical proficiency. Is the image exposed properly? Is it in focus? Is it, is it so grainy that you can't make out any detail? Like all these things fall into the technical things, just like basic camera operation. There's times to where I've had to shoot stories in a very short amount of time and they needed 5 pictures and I only had 3 that I felt okay about, and I had to put 2 other pictures in there that weren't that great, but technically they were good enough to show in a newspaper. That we don't ever want to have that be the test of like, okay, this is a good picture. It's just technical proficiency. Just because it's in focus doesn't mean it's good. And for all the people that love to shoot, their 50 millimeter 1.8 or 1.4 wide open aperture to have the background completely out of focus, I don't know how many students I hear say, I like the focus on that picture. What they mean is, I like that the background's out of focus. That in no way qualifies it as being a good picture. Zero. It maybe is technically proficient because there's something in focus in the picture. But that doesn't give it any more than just the most mediocre basic qualification as being a photograph. Okay, so the next tier up, and this tier and the next one, you could swap, I think. You could, depending on what your goals are, depending on the type of work that you're doing. I'm coming from more of a photojournalistic standpoint with this structure, so your mileage may vary. But the next tier up, I put content and information. So bottom tier, is the photograph technically proficient? The next one, does it have information or content in it that is pertinent or appropriate to the work and the story that you're doing? Every photograph is only 2 things. There's only 2 things that you could break down. If you need to talk about a photograph, you can easily talk about any photograph in 2 ways. It is content. What is the information that I have in the image? There's a man. He is sitting here. There's a bird flying through the sky. Content and form, the formal qualities, the aesthetic qualities. How is the picture arranged? What is the light like? What are the colors that I see and what do they evoke within me? Compositionally, how does this picture work? All of that is the formal qualities of the image, okay? So you can always talk about pictures in 2 categories. You could break them down into 2 things: the information, the content, and the form, okay? So I would say the next tier is just content. Does it have the appropriate information in it? If you're telling me a story about ducks and your pictures are of cats, it's going to be very confusing for the viewer. Why are you telling me a photo story about ducks and you're showing me cats? This seems really basic, but I have students do this kind of stuff all the time. So does it have the appropriate content in it? The next tier up, which would make it a better photograph, is the formal qualities. Is the photograph well composed? Is the light really interesting? And does the light draw me into the picture? The way that, each person exists in the frame, the gesture that a person's body is making, what are the lines doing? Are there repeating forms in there? All these types of things, when we just talk about the aesthetic quality of the picture, give it greater value. Sometimes you can have a picture that's technically proficient and it has information in it and it's like, meh. But if it's well composed, if it's well seen, then that's going to amplify the quality and how good the picture is and how interesting the picture is. Okay, this should be pretty basic, pretty obvious. The next tier is we're going from very concrete to a little less concrete the further we move up the pyramid. I call this emotional impact, and emotional impact is built upon the bottom three components, because what you see in the picture and how it is composed is going to theoretically evoke some sort of emotional reality within you. Now, it doesn't always, but the emotional impact that you get from a picture is built upon the content of what you're seeing and its formal qualities. It's not some mystical magic kind of like wow thing. All the bottom 3 things build up to an emotional impact if they do. Theoretically, they do. The emotional impact comes from those qualities. And I would say, that's our goals. We want our images to stir something within somebody so that they connect with that image, so they relate to that image, so they question something because of that image. Like it appeals to them on a way that is less cerebral and is more gut. How do you get somebody in their gut? not just data in their mind. That's something that photographs can do, and that's one of their strengths. So how do we get that emotional impact from them? But it is built upon those other qualities. And there's exceptions to this rule. Sometimes an image is not technically correct, it's out of focus, it's blurry and it's grainy, but because that is twisting and manipulating our presuppositions of what technical proficiency is, that might create a certain discomfort or emotional impact on our viewer. But you have to know those rules before you can stretch and push and pull and move them around in order to evoke the right emotional reaction from your viewer. So different viewers will respond to things emotionally in different ways. It's not always universal. Not every person is going to respond to something as deeply as the person standing next to them. And so again, we're getting this is less concrete the further we go up. And the last tier I've given, which is the place that I feel like maybe I've never achieved, or I've never made an image like this, and if I have, maybe it's only one or two in my career, is this other quality. It's a hard to describe thing. It's when you see something and it hits you so deeply that like you think about it, you dream about it, it resonates with you. You see an image or a picture and you don't even think about the formal qualities and the content. It just strikes you in such a deep way. It's the furthest from a cerebral experience that you can get. And I don't even have a name for this. This is the unnamed quality of an image. And I think this is the absolute goal of making a picture that does this to someone. I remember the first time I saw a Van Gogh painting in person. And it's completely different to see a painting in person than it is in a book or on the internet or whatever. I remember rounding a corner in this gallery in DC, and there's this little painting, maybe, not very big. And I remember looking at it, and it was just like something in my soul moved. And I'm not really like, I haven't studied painting. I'm not a painter. I don't have a master's in art history or anything like that. But I knew instantaneously why that painting has survived the test of time, is that it had some sort of magical quality that strikes, and obviously it strikes a lot of other people if it's existed this long, in this very deep place. And I think that is something that we should always, hope that our images can get towards, but we have to build our way up. And that type of experience is not common. If I hear somebody in a critique say, wow, this image just has a magical quality, oftentimes it's just they say that because they don't know how to articulate the technical proficiency, the content that's in the image, the formal qualities, and how that affects the emotional impact of what they're seeing. So I often doubt if somebody uses that really flippantly. I have a lot of doubt, because that's a very special place that is rarely achieved. But I think that it is achieved at times, and you know it when you see it. But we should always work towards explaining that based upon everything below it, because in reality, whatever that magical quality that an image or a painting or whatever might have, it is still based upon the content of what's being seen, the formal qualities of that thing that you're looking at, that photograph or painting or sculpture or whatever, and how that translates into an emotional impact, and then how that is in some way elevated or teases out some subconscious thing in your mind that causes you to connect with it in a very special way. Obviously I really enjoy the photo editing portion and talking about photo editing. I have a whole class devoted to just breaking down this pyramid and working through it, and working towards like, how do we discuss what is a really great picture, because a lot of times it's not what you think it is, or it'll open up a world of image making and images to you that you didn't previously think was good or interesting. It's kind of like the first time you have sushi. Before it's like, no, that might be gross, and then you have it and you're like, wow, this is great. So that's one of the joys of like a class like that, is helping people understand how wonderful some things are, helping them expand their aesthetic knowledge. Okay, so that's editing and choosing pictures. You want to choose pictures that move as far up that hierarchy as possible. And I always start with, like, when I'm cutting down, trimming down my images, like, does this technically work, and is it, like, formally and, like, content wise good enough? And that very quickly, I can cut anything that doesn't do that out very fast and trim that down to a smaller group of images to look at. Once I've trimmed down a smaller group of images that are like, okay, these are halfway decent, then I take them over to the toning phase, the color correction phase. Now, the reason that we save color correction for this stage in the game is that you don't want to spend time in Lightroom or Photoshop, or if you're working in a darkroom still, like, you don't want to spend time toning and color correcting images that aren't good. You don't want to waste your time on that. Time is precious and valuable, and if you are color correcting all the images that you shot, then you are wasting your time. Like, why would you ever do that? If you have to do a lot of color correction to an image before you decide on if it's good or not, I would say it's probably not good enough. Probably not. So we want to only devote that time, that color correction time, to the images that deserve it. Okay? And when we do that, we want to be consistent with our process, with our, how we color correct images. Consistency is very, very important. I would say, with color correction, because we live in a digital world and there's a lot of digital, like, looks and actions and all these things, like, there's a temptation to use all these different, like, actions in Lightroom or Photoshop to make all these different looking pictures. And I would say 95% of the time that's bad news, total bad news, because what you end up with is just this, smattering of random looking images, and they don't, it's very confusing for a viewer, because when someone sees something that's color corrected in very different ways, they're saying that these don't go together, these aren't connected. So by having a consistent process in which you color correct your images, we all, color correct slightly differently. We might see the images being a little bit more cool, or a little bit more warm, or a little more contrast, or a little less contrast. If you're consistent across a body of work, what that does is that helps the viewer connect all those things together. It's like when you meet a family, and the mom and the dad and their kids, like, their kids look exactly like the mom and the dad. They all look like they go together. Everybody's probably met a family like that where they have like 10 kids and all the kids look like their parents, and you're like, oh yeah, that's one of those kids for sure. That helps the viewer make connections between the images in a story. So if you are going to push the boundaries of how your images are color corrected, you need to keep it consistent across the board. But I would say a good place to start is have a good color, like, way you color correct images in color, and have a way that you color correct images in black and white, and just try to stick with those two processes, those two kind of judgments on how you color correct your images in Lightroom or Photoshop or in the darkroom or whatever. And I would avoid any sort of trendy thing. For years, the trend has been, like, at one point in time, it was like super crunchy black and white documentary pictures, and then it was like, super low contrast color pictures, and sometimes it's a Technicolor. In the 80s and 90s, there was sometimes these, like, hyper color images, and you just want to try to take a step back and avoid anything that's too trendy, because, like all trends, they come to an end and it looks really dated. So I would say be tasteful. Good taste goes a long, long way when it comes to color correction. So after your images are kind of color corrected and you think about them as having relationships with one another, that's why we try to color correct them in a way that they actually sit together. Okay, they feel like they go together because of the consistency across the palette that's being used. Then we actually want to sequence those images, and we want to put them in order. Now this is where the magic comes in with longer form storytelling. Photographs as individual parts are really bad at communicating information. They're terrible ways to convey data. Terrible. It's not a great way to give someone information. But by getting these little snippets from each picture and then putting a bunch of pictures together, you end up with a large poem that can be very interesting then, because there's a lot of work that the viewer has to do to fill in the gaps. I would say probably one of the best qualities of a picture is that because it lacks so much information, it invites the viewer to put information in those holes with their own personal story, with their own personal narratives, with their own experiences. So by sequencing images together, you can take someone on a journey in which they're filling in the gaps, they're making associations with images to take them on a journey of the narrative of the piece. And I use the word narrative and story kind of loosely because a sequence or a grouping of pictures doesn't have to have a straight story necessarily. It might just be creating a space for the viewer to experience. It's not an A to B narrative. It doesn't have to be that. In photojournalism, typically it is. But again, that's just generally speaking. There are a lot of other ways to tell stories other than, like point A to point B narrative. So as you make a sequence of images, you have to think about like, what relationships do the pictures have with each other? And how do I group the pictures together with their relationships? Now, I don't group pictures based upon their content, okay? If two pictures have very similar information, I don't want to like repeat that, and we'll get to that soon. But the viewer is going to make associations with the pictures based upon the information that they're seeing and the aesthetics of the pictures, how the pictures are arranged and composed, the color palettes, the lines involved in the picture. All these things are going to cause the viewer to make associations between these pictures. The pictures are going to play off of each other regardless, if those things connect to one another. So you want to take a step back and you want to think about like, where does this narrative begin? Where's my beginning images? Where do I want it to end? Generally speaking, this is the way that I work. It's not the only way, but this is the way I like to work. Where do I want kind of like the images to land? And then how do I take someone on that journey from the beginning, those first couple of images, to those last images? How do I take someone across that? And really those first several images really need to hook in the viewer. They need to grab the viewer's attention. Because, like you're competing with every other thing that person is seeing that day. You're competing with thousands of other images that person is consuming. So you really have to grab them really quickly. So those first images really need to grab the attention of the viewer. Then maybe you can cool off the narrative, but you have to pull them in first. As you pull them in, you have to keep them there. And so the images need to keep the viewer. It needs to keep adding to the narrative in some way, or causing doubt, or adding a question and then barely resolving it. You have to keep drawing them in to take them through the narrative until you take them to the end. Now, as I said earlier, your pictures are going to be connected both because they're about a subject matter or content, and they're going to have formal qualities aesthetically that connect them as well. When I'm grouping pictures together and whenever I'm sequencing, a trick that I use often is I will take pairs or 2 or 3 pictures, and I will find the relationships between just 2 pictures or 3 pictures, and I'll break them into these little codas almost, these little few word portions. And then after I take those 2 or 3 images, I try to see what of those other ones connect end on end. It's kind of like playing dominoes. If anybody's ever played dominoes, how do I find these ones that connect end on end? And then once I have bigger sections, then I move those bigger sections around to see which connect on those ends. But to do that, the connections rarely happen based upon content to content. Okay, those are not very interesting ways to connect pictures. If we're doing a piece about ducks, if we have a picture of a yellow duck and then another picture of a yellow duck, or a picture of a yellow duck and then a picture of a white duck, that connection isn't going to be very interesting, because the information, the cerebral part of the experience, is too on the nose. It's too easy. But if we have a picture of a yellow duck and then a picture of a yellow balloon in the next frame over, the person is going to connect the aesthetic quality of the yellow to the yellow, and their brain is going to say, what's the connection between the duck and the balloon? Now that's a lot more interesting than this is a duck and this is a duck. So we want to make associations formally. We want to group pictures formally more so than we want to group them based upon the information that they have in the picture, because the information goes right to the cerebral part of the brain, is processed, and doesn't allow any problem. There's no problem solving involved. There's no reason for the viewer to try to figure out what they're seeing or to be surprised in any way. So we want to make connections aesthetically from picture to picture more so than from a content or informational standpoint from picture to picture. Okay? Now, as you start to put these little clumps together, and as they, start to come together, there's going to be narratives and story, or, however you want to say that start to emerge from those associations that maybe you didn't even intend for there to be there at first. The goal is that as you start to group these images together, that their associations are actually more, and they're bigger than the sum of the parts. Like the end of that sequence of images is actually more powerful than its individual members. That the relationships that they have now create a bigger and better and greater thing. That's our goal when we're sequencing our images, because an individual photograph is just very limited in what it can do. But the ambiguity of several images together pushes and pulls the viewer through a narrative, and that becomes way more interesting, way more compelling, way more inviting for a person participating in that narrative, in that story, by consuming it. So as we sequence those images together, we start to make those associations. These 3 go together, these 5 go together. Almost every time what you'll see is like, there are holes here. These 3 and these 5 don't connect. There's something missing in between in our sequence. And that really helps inform us as we go back out. We start the cycle over, back to our shooting phase. It helps us know what we're going to be looking for when we go back out in the field. And maybe it's not content. Maybe it's just a form. Maybe it's like, if I just had like a bit of light going through here in a picture, landing on something of this color, that would really unite these 2 strings of images in a really lovely way, how they move together. And some of this just happens subconsciously when you're looking at these pictures over and over. Your brain starts to see that hole there, and when you go back out to make pictures, your brain starts to look for that puzzle piece that fits right in the middle to connect those things together. So every time, we go through this process, each of those phases are going to take us back to the beginning. It may be a very short run. You may make some pictures, go to the editing phase, and realize all of your pictures are out of focus. That your lens, there's something wrong with your lens, or there's something wrong with your technique, and all the pictures are bad. So you go back to the shooting phase. You may get to the toning phase, and you may realize that, I'm shooting in a lot of really high contrast light, and then a lot of very low contrast light, back and forth, and they're hard to tone, and when I start to sequence them, they're not sitting together well. So maybe I need to choose, like, work in low contrast lighting for a while, or maybe I need to only be in that setting sunlight. That really helps me connect this. Each of those phases are going to inform the other phase, and help you know where to go from there. And you're always going to go back to shooting. At the end of every project that I'm doing, that last couple of weeks when I have a deadline, I'm usually still making a few pictures at the very end. Even if I've been making pictures for 3 or 4 years, oftentimes I'll have one little gap somewhere, and I'll be hitting the streets or out somewhere looking for filling that one little gap in the sequence with an image. It takes me back to the shooting phase. So I always end up going back to the shooting phase. But as I move back to those different phases, I'm better informed to know how to go about that. And really that makes those other phases much easier. The thing is, if you become a really great editor and you know what a good picture is, when you go out to make pictures, you're going to know you're going to see the better pictures quicker, and you're going to spend less time wasting your time on what's going to be a bad picture, because you've trained your mind on what is a good picture, what is a good picture, what is interesting, what is just doing the same thing that someone else has done. Being a really good editor really helps you be a good shooter. Same thing with like if you're if you're thinking about sequencing. Like I said before, I'll have a long sequence of images and I need one more images. That's going to make me a more intentional photographer, because I'm going to be intentional about what I'm photographing to fill that little hole. If you're toning practice, if you're getting in the toning practice and you realize that your exposures, even on for a lot of new photographers, when you're toning, you'll realize my exposure is all over the place. Sometimes it's like a half a stop or a full stop too dark. Sometimes it's a full stop too bright. That helps inform your shooting practice, that I need to be more consistent on how I need to be metering more consistently. I need to always maybe be underexposing a third of a stop, because that gets me more information, or 2/3 of a stop. So when I'm toning, I can keep my skies. That makes you a better shooter. So all these things, they build upon each other, which is really great. Like each of these phases, because I've had friends in the past that were all about shooting but didn't want to edit their photos. They would want to send it off for someone else to edit them, but they're missing out on an opportunity to really grow their practice by being better editors. Being a good editor is gonna make your shooting practice much better. They all have they're related to one another. They have relationships with one another, and you have to spend time working on each portion. It doesn't come naturally to all people. Some phases are harder than other phases for some people. That's probably tells you that you don't need to avoid that phase. You need to work on that phase. You need to put in the time. I used to have the worst eye for color correction. I would always color correct things like either way too magenta or way too cool, way too blue. And when I was shooting a lot of film and scanning a lot of film, that was just exacerbated by that. So I spent a lot of time trying to make it right. I would look at other pictures. I would pull my pictures up. I would say, look at the differences between something that's color corrected really well and my pictures. And I would say, what are the differences? This has a bit more green in it. My picture has way too much magenta in it. And I would work through and work through and work through and work through. So I developed my eye to see color appropriately and to color correct appropriately. Just because you're not good at it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. That usually means that's the thing you should do if you're not good at it, okay? And the final thing that I just want to say is that the reality is that all practitioners make a lot of pictures. And most of the pictures that every practitioner makes are not very good. They're usually not good at all. They're not that interesting. This is not a professional sport. If it were, we would all fail miserably, but that's not how photography works. Really, the trick to being a good photographer is knowing when you hit that 0.01% of good pictures. When you make a good picture, it's identifying that's a good picture. I should keep that. That's a successful photograph, and these are not. And I'm not going to be those, it's not personal. Just because those are bad pictures doesn't, it's not a personal attack on my own self. It's not a failure necessarily. It's being able to distance yourself and say, these are not good pictures, throw them away, but these 3 pictures are really good. How do I build upon that? And how do I only show the good ones? I would say good photographers just know the difference between good and bad pictures when they make them, and they don't show the bad ones. And they try to only show the good ones. That really is the trick, because anybody can make a nice picture, anybody, just through probability. Even if your mother has her cell phone out and has never made a picture in her life, and she doesn't. My mom's notorious for, she used to cut people's heads off in pictures all the time. But, I'll find pictures here and there. They're fantastic pictures that my mom made. But she doesn't know that. She doesn't understand what is and isn't a good picture. So I would say a lot of the process for you is just, how do I understand what a good picture is? And I only show the good ones, and I don't show any of the bad ones. And that in and of itself is the basic process of photo editing. So I hope this was enlightening. I hope this was helpful. It took me a long time to learn a lot of these things, and they may not all be right. If you have thoughts or whatever, please, reach out to me. Let me know things that are helpful for you in your practice. That would be helpful for me to understand too, so that I can, again, share those with my students. And so I hope this was helpful for you. I hope this makes sense. If you have questions, please ask, and I'll be more than happy to answer them.